Welcome to MBA 543, St. Francis University. I am Adam Conrad, your instructor, and this section is on Chapter 14, Adapting the Close and Confirming the Partnership. A couple of things we'll be talking about in this chapter will be the proper attitude to display toward closing the sale, listing and discussing guidelines for closing the sale, explaining how to recognize closing cues, discuss specific methods of closing the sale, and explain what to do when the buyer says yes and what to do when the buyer says no. So we talk about a couple of things here. I'll add in a little bit of extra things that I've learned over the years to help with the closing. In the 6-step presentation plan we've been talking about in these last chapters, this is step 5, so we're focusing on the close, which is a couple of things we'll be talking about. So closing of these 6 steps really is not to be viewed as winning over the client, but really at the expense of the client. It's really designed to be this mutual, beneficial, win-win type of situation. So the proper attitude in this is, if this is the best solution for the customer, I should help her make the contract decision. So again, it's what's right for the client that matters. Once you've gotten to that point, asking for the business, asking for the sale is the next logical step. So we need to review the value proposition from the customer's perspective, because again, it only matters if it matters to the client. It's usually easier if you look at it from the prospect's point of view. You look at it and say, yes, this makes a lot of sense to do the deal. We a lot of times like to think that the salesperson is really selling the client, and in many cases it's the client finally coming to the conclusion after all of the sales steps that this is the right thing for them. So it is, however, one of the things that salespeople often overlook and salespeople often miss is asking for the business, asking for the sale, and closing. But it is truly the responsibility of the salesperson to make sure that we get that commitment from the client. Sometimes we have clients that are indecisive. They can't make up their mind. So we need to use some tools at our disposal to help them move from that indecision into a commitment. The important thing about that, of course, is to make sure that the client doesn't feel pressured in the process. We want to make sure that they feel it's natural and it's their decision. So one of the things we need to really do is make sure we don't use what we call defense-arousing language. Hey, this is the lowest price you're going to find anywhere, so you should buy it. You want to turn that around and take it into, turn it into, wouldn't this solution or wouldn't this software, wouldn't this product help you achieve, better inventory control, for example. So it's really about casting it in a positive note, and again, letting the client confirm the value proposition and make sure that they feel like this is the right thing to do. So again, you got to shift gears. One of the things I pride myself in is always the ability to put myself in the other person's shoes. When you're negotiating, you really have to see it from their standpoint. If you negotiate with only a perspective of what you're winning and what you're achieving, and you're not looking at it from the point of view of the other party, you'll find yourself in a position where you don't get many deals done. So a couple of things you can do, like on the slide here, is really just reminding yourself, have you effectively summarized the mix of key benefits? Does the proposal provide a solution that solves the customer's problem? Obviously, we should be at that stage. And is it enough to win them over? Sometimes there's what we call a critical event. So you need something that pushes the client over the edge, so to speak, that makes them have to want to do it. Like a good example is a client is using a software program that's no longer receiving updates. So now they're in a position where, a good example of that is the systems that have to do 1099s, particularly around the first of the year. If you have a software program and it's got to have a mandatory update to do like electronic 1099s, for example, and you got to do thousands of these, it's going to be critical for that client to make a decision so that they can be ready for that next, for the next 1099 season to be able to get those out the door. Buyer's remorse. So let's talk about buyer's remorse. This is when the buyer, when there's emotional stress, which the buyer essentially feels bad about their decision. Some anxieties explaining why customers are reluctant to commit to your proposal. is mainly fear of making a mistake. I mean, that's why a lot of folks will center on brands. They'll center on, just renewing with their current vendor, because there's not as much of, we talked about the difference between the new buy versus the modified rebuy versus, strict rebuy. You take a look at those and you think, well, a rebuy, a straight rebuy, or just renewing your existing contract, very few people are going to raise issue with that. But if you switch out a whole software system for something new, everybody's going to be griping. And so everybody's going to be within the organization, pointing the finger at the decision maker. So this is why a lot of things just continue on, because that person's got a fear of making a mistake. Social or peer pressure is the same thing. So it's not just a fear of them making a mistake, it's everybody else in the company coming down on them. So it really becomes, it's one of those things that you run into a lot, particularly in the software business, where there's a lot of effort around replacing a system, and it means that somebody's going to be held accountable if it doesn't go well. Closing the sale. So Tom Riley, author of Value-Added Selling, points out that you don't close sales, you build commitment to a course of action that brings value to the customer and profit to the seller. For those of you in the HR side of this, we have a number of students that are on the HR track. You probably learned in the HR arena that when you have to fire somebody, it should not come as a surprise to the person who's being fired. If you followed the process that you've set up, it should not come as a shock to them. It's certainly an unfortunate event, but it shouldn't look like it came out of nowhere, or else you probably didn't follow your proper procedures. Closing the sale shares a similarity to that, and that is the fact that, when you go to close a deal, it should feel natural. It shouldn't feel like a lot of pressure. It should be, yes, this is the right decision to make. We've budgeted for it. We've evaluated all the vendor options. We know that this is the right thing to do, and we just need to go ahead and get the thing signed. Some guidelines for closing the sale. So there's a number of factors that increase the odds that the salesperson will close the sale. Obviously, presentation strategy should have, confirmed for the client all of the things that the product or service is going to do. So we can run down through the slide here real quick, and you see, the strategic planning for closing the sale. You review barriers to closing the sale. What is it? Budget? Is it, the switching cost? Is it the switching timeline? What is that? The closing guidelines. What's it take to contract with us? What's the upfront fees? What's the time frame? And then we talk about some closing methods that we can use, and we'll talk more about those. You plan to ask for the order more than once, because it's frequent that the client doesn't respond to the first couple of times you ask. And you want to practice. You want to rehearse and think about the things. In big corporations where there's big stakes when it comes to the selection of things like software, we'll often role play. We'll have somebody sales manager will play the CFO of a hospital and say, raise all the objections to why we're not going to choose the system, or why we're not contracting for it right now. Actions during the close, you're going to be recognizing closing cues, focusing on a point of greatest interest. So you're going to highlight, the closing cues. It could be simply they start asking about delivery time frames, or they start asking about billing methods. How frequently do you bill us, or what's the time commitment? And so when they ask you things like that, those are typically closing cues. You focus on the greatest point of interest, and it could be the critical event that they have. Again, I use an example of 1099s. I mean, if they can't get a 1099 out the door, that's going to be a huge issue for them. You handle tough points early, like switching. I'll give you an example. Personally, I'm looking at switching software for my title company. And in the process of switching, one of the tough points about that is I have to maintain access to my current record base. Well, that means I have an additional expense every month if I have to maintain that. So it might be smart for me to handle, the vendor has to handle those tough points early. You want to avoid surprises in the closing process. If you've asked all the right questions and you've done your homework, you should be able to avoid surprises. You want to keep your prospect involved in the process. You don't want to let this thing linger and take weeks or months to go through the closing process, because they can lose interest. The other thing that happens a lot of times is that something else comes up. So they're in the process of selecting this, and oh boy, they get acquired by another company, or they merge, or there's all kinds of things that can happen. So you want to keep them involved and keep it moving along, because you'd be surprised how many roadblocks can come up during the process. Display confidence. Again, if you've done all your homework, it's pretty straightforward. If you've done all your homework, then you'll know that you've done everything correctly, so that you can expect that this thing is going to close and it's going to make it happen. Accommodate the buyer's communication style. So in this case, you're going to be looking at, the buyer communicates a certain way. They may be extremely non-responsive, and then all of a sudden they'll rattle off a bunch of email messages to you. So you kind of have to just figure out how they like to be communicated with. Is text good for them? Is it email, or is it a phone call? And again, you got to ask. You got to ask. That's very important. So some guidelines for closing the sale. Again, you want to focus on those dominant buying motives. I talked about earlier. What's the trigger event? What's the critical event that's occurring? Achieve incremental commitments throughout the sales process. So you get them saying yes. Yes, we agree. This is the one thing this is what we need to do. Yes, this is the right product. We like it better than the others. So it gets those incremental commitments along the way, so that it's not just one big ask at the end. It's you've made, so you can repeat that as you go. So at the end, you say, look, well, you've agreed that this fits your budget. You've agreed that it's the best superior software solution. You've agreed that we have your timeline for implementation set. You've agreed that, so you can see how you can build those little commitments along the way. And again, negotiate those tough points. So this is just a little bit of a recap of that prior slide, but it reinforces the fact that you've got to get those incremental commitments along the way. Again, if you believe that you have the right product, you'll have all the confidence in the world. And you'll be shocked and amazed if it doesn't happen. But it shouldn't come as a surprise if you lose, because you should have, along the way, identified all of the areas where there shouldn't be any out of the left field surprises that come at you in the process. I mentioned earlier closing cues. These can be verbal or nonverbal. I like to ask in person, because you can learn a lot from nonverbal cues. It's really hard to read email and text to try to determine, or even over the phone, to try to determine exactly where you are in the process. So a lot of times it's going to require an in-person visit. Verbal cues, like I mentioned earlier, if they ask you questions about the implementation timeline, or ask you questions about billing processes. Do you take payment through ACH? These are all good, very good questions. Clues. Nonverbal clues can be body movement, facial expressions, and tone of voice. Keep in mind that you're dealing a lot of times with trained negotiators. So at some point, you're going to want to make sure you have a negotiation course under your belt, because some people are very good at giving you mixing up the cues and putting you totally off balance. So you want to make sure that you pick up on those. But sometimes, an inquisitive eyebrow raise, when they're paying close attention to you, oftentimes are good solid cues. Nodding of the head, really good cues that you're doing well in the closing process. Methods of closing the sale. Now, you can actually read whole books on just the closing. Everything from, there's just such a variety of these. We're actually going to talk about a couple of them. One of the ones I like is the trial close, and that's really just asking perhaps a good bit earlier than what you might expect. I think I mentioned this in an earlier video where I used to sell VCRs back in the day when video cassette recorders were a big deal. And I would literally, as I was seminar selling and I still had half my pitch to go, I would see a lot of confirmation. I'd see nonverbal cues, people nodding their head, some of them acting a little bit impatient, like, I get it, I'll take one now. So I would just stop and say, how many would like to take one right now? And I would just peel them off, send them to get to the cash wrap to get them checked out. And that was a trial close. A lot of these are like assumptive close, where you're basically saying, well, based on all of these things, we just, we all agree that this is the right thing to do. So here's the purchase order, and I guess I can expect that back, in the next day or so from you. Just assuming that it's going to happen. Summary of benefits close, where you're basically summarizing all of the things that are the key benefits to your solution, to your tool, whatever you're selling, and summarizing those benefits and say, well, After all of those things add up, you would agree, Ms. Prospect, that this is the right solution and that you should be ready to go. So all kinds of different things you can do here. Special concession close, where, and this is the timed offer, right? You see this on television all the time. So special concession close is, look, if you do this today, I'll kick in the training for free. It's the end of the quarter, we'll kick in the training for free. The only problem with that type of concession close is that you'll find that you teach clients to wait for the offer or the coupon, so to speak, rather than, the normal process and your normal pricing. Multiple options. Okay, so you want system A or system B. Which one will you be choosing? Should I write you up for system B? You see the idea here. Management close. Senior management's going to come in and meet with you, and they may have something extra or special to offer. We want to make you a key client. We want to make you a reference account. There's all kinds of things you can do with that. And the combination close is, using a couple of these different techniques. So there's, really a bunch of different closing techniques. You'll find in your organization that certain ones are typically used. Don't be afraid to try others, particularly trial close. I like trial close a lot because sometimes you can find out that you can actually close it up earlier than you might have thought without as much effort. One thing you want to be very careful about is what we call walking past the sale. Or selling past the sale, where you miss the opportunity to close and then you talk yourself out of it, or you talk the client out of it. So that can be dangerous as well. And so there's some examples in closing worksheet where the direct appeal close, the closing clue. The client says that sounds fine, and it says, "Good. May I get your signature on this order form?" The assumptive close. Well, we don't have large amounts of cash available at this time. And the closing statement is, based on your cash position, I'd recommend you consider our lease purchase plan. This plan allows you to pay a very small initial amount at this time and keep the cash you now have for your everyday business expenses. I'll be happy to write up your order on that lease purchase plan. Again, just assuming that you got it, which is an example of how that fits all together. Again, getting back to some more details on these, we have some slides that actually go into some more detail that I actually already came up with here. Again, that trial close, it's made at an opportune time early on to determine, are they willing or not willing to buy? You oftentimes uncover things very quickly, where there might be some little barrier or something in there that's going to keep you from the business. It's sometimes known as the minor point close. It's appropriate when you're reasonably sure the prospect is about to make a decision, but it's held back by some sort of caution. It's also oftentimes presented in the form of a confirmation question, which is, like, we've agreed that this meets your budget and fixes your 1099 problem, so why don't we go ahead and get this done now? And so you'll find that you'll suss out maybe some other issue that's out there that you didn't expect. The direct appeal close, again, diving into these a little bit more, involves simply asking for the order in a straightforward manner. And so just, I'd like you to purchase this. Is it okay to go ahead and get your signature on this purchase order? You want to be careful about that because some people might view that the wrong way and might not feel like they've gotten all their questions answered, or that you haven't earned the right to their business yet. So obviously direct appeal close is not something you want to talk about on the first visit. The assumptive close asks for a minor decision. And it assumes the customer's already decided to buy, and it's oftentimes referred to as a take it for granted close. So it comes near the end of a planned presentation. It's a subtle way to ask for a decision when you're pretty sure they've already made a decision to buy. So assumptive close is sort of like a bit like a trial close, but it's again, it's a little bit assumptive. Hey, I expect that you're going to do this based on our presentation nailed it. It's all the things you're expecting. A multiple option, or if you're going to configure a multiple option close, it's important, like if you have more than one product solution, where you may have multiple options for them, you need to cease presenting product options when they've been given ample selection. One of the things car dealers do is make sure that they quickly eliminate the multiple option. You'll see this when you go to buy a car. they are very keen on settling you in on one car. They will only negotiate with you on one car. If you say, I'm looking at these three, and it might be three on their own lot. They may be three different kind of variations on the same car. They'll try to narrow you down to a single car, and then they'll negotiate on that. They don't want to negotiate on three separate simultaneous things. So multiple options close will usually, from a salesperson, like a car salesperson, will say, let's narrow you down on this, and this is the one you like the best. It's the color you chose. It's missing the leather seats. We'll swap the seats out of the other one, whatever you got to do. You get the idea that it's very important for them to be able to negotiate on just a single car. The balance sheet close is really just writing it out. It's, reasons for buying now, reasons for not buying now. So we use this, we don't call it this, but we use this in real estate. Reasons for selling now is as simple as writing down their monthly expenses for maintaining a property. If they're saying, well, I'm not in a hurry to sell, or if we have an offer on the table and they say, well, I don't want to take that offer, we a lot of times want to detail their monthly carrying costs of a property. So if we come up with the fact that it's $1,800 a month for the property for them to hold on to it, and then we show them that this offer that's $5,000 less than they want, say, look, that's that's really about 70 days of ownership. So, or 80 days of ownership. So, the reality is if you turn this offer down that's $5,000 less, you're going to carry the property for another, couple of months until you sell it. It's really the same thing. Now, unfortunately for us as real estate salespeople, the sellers will often expect that since they got an offer today, that there's another offer coming right in behind it. And we know often that that's not the case. One thing you learn in the real estate business is your first offer is often your best offer. Other types of closes, I talked about these in some earlier slides, so we'll go ahead and skip these here. But it is important, again, like I said earlier in the session, to adapt to the communication style of the client. I kind of tailored that more towards they like email versus text or whatever. But the four styles that they have are reflective, emotive, directive, and supportive. So directive is goal-oriented, people who like to make quick decisions once they believe the solution meets their needs. The emotive person needs social acceptance to support their opinions and ideas. The supportive will likely be slow in making a buying decision. They're more apt to worry about change or taking risks. Pressure may make the supportive buyer more indecisive, so you gotta be careful with that type. So patience is important. And then reflective values information and less likely to be influenced by emotion. So never pressure the reflective customer to make a quick decision. So that goes into a bit more depth than what I talked about in just terms of the mechanism of how you're communicating with them is more the style. So you want to match up with that style to make sure that you're not putting pressure. Some clients, you got to change it up, just like with employees. Some clients you got to say, you got to be really direct back and forth. You're dealing from somebody in New Jersey outside of New York City. They may expect a certain style different than somebody in Kansas. So geographic differences exist as well. So what happens when the buyer says, yes, congratulations, you closed the sale. Now it's time to reassure the customer, which is a confirmation step in closing the sale to prevent buyer's remorse, and thank them for the order. Reassure them by pointing out that she made the right decision. Describe the satisfaction will come with the product or service. The reason to do this, of course, is to prevent that buyer's remorse. It's that emotional response that make them have anxiety about making that decision. They may, as a customer, be required to justify this purchase to other people. So it's critical that you give them all the tools to defend the decision. Again, thanking them for the order is a super good idea. And so it's not something you want to just take for granted. Follow-up thank you note and handwritten notes. We oftentimes don't do this. We do things electronically. An e-card is not going to be nearly as powerful as a handwritten card. What do you do if the buyer says no? If you lose a sale, you want to make sure the deal's really dead. I mean, you want to make sure, and I have a story along with this too, but make sure the deal's really dead. You got to make sure that it's not going to happen. And you can ask a lot of questions about that, but generally a lot of clients shut down and don't want to talk to you much whenever they have to tell. Most people don't like to tell you no. So they don't want to have a long chat about why no. But you'd be surprised. Some people will be more forthcoming, and you can actually ask them, interview the client, and ask them for some tips. So like, what could we have done better? How could we have earned your business? Of course, you want to learn a lot of those things in advance, but you want to review the steps in the chain of events. How did this happen? One thing that I actually had a company that early on in my sales career that was insistent that we call into a lost sale. We lost a software sale, insistent that we call in and try to turn the deal around. And once a client, what I learned, and I did this a couple of times at the direction of my manager, and what I learned is this. Once people make a decision for no, it's extremely difficult to turn that decision around. Again, I think it takes a critical event to change it. So after a couple of bad experiences of trying to get people to move from no to yes and convert and turn that around, I simply asked my manager how many of these we have ever turned around as a company. And you could hear crickets. The reality was we'd never turned one around. And I said, well, then I'm just not going to try to turn them around anymore, because all it was doing was souring the relationship with somebody that I had still a decent relationship with. They liked what we were offering, that we were even in the process. And now we came off as, we come off badly as a result, I think, of that reactive behavior of trying to turn that around. So I simply stopped doing it. When somebody said no, be gracious. Appreciate that. If you have a couple of minutes, I'd like to talk with you about what we could have done different. Mind if I stop by? We'll have lunch sometime. You'd be surprised how disarming that is whenever you don't act all defensive whenever you lose a deal. And that actually was very helpful to me. So I've learned a lot from that whole process. So in review for Chapter 14, we described the proper attitude to display towards closing the sale, talked about some guidelines for closing the sale, explained how to recognize some of those closing cues, and discuss some specific methods of closing the sale, and what to do when the buyer says yes, and absolutely what to do when they say no. That's the end of Chapter 14.